Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Amber and this is Fundy Free. Today we have a really special guest. Joel is with us today to tell his story, and I'm really excited to have you today, Joel. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, tell us, Joel, a little bit about your background. What belief did you kind of grow up in?
I grew up in basically on the Indiana-Michigan border, and I grew up independent fundamental Baptist, and so I'm sure you're familiar with the sect. Um,
Yes.
yeah, very patriarchal, very sectarian, as in um, we our church wouldn't associate with any other denominations, and they would only associate with other IFB churches. So, yeah.
Yeah, would your church, because my church was the exact same, the churches that I was in, where we would only associate with other IFB. But there was also inside the IFB other IFB churches we would not associate with because we deemed them too liberal or too, just something wasn't right with them. And so we were
Hmm.
very, very like secluded.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I find with fundamentalists is that they a huge part of their identity is like how narrow they can draw their circle. So um, you never know when a person or another church will do something to set off another person or another church, and they're like, oh, we can't associate with them, they're you know so
Yes, they're wearing blue pants today, and our belief is brown pants. I mean, because it was really
right,
some stupid stuff like that.
right.
Um, I remember my dad. We moved us around a lot under the guise of evangelical. He's an evangelist, and he would go into churches, and they would kick him out if he were with him wearing wire rim glasses, or if he wasn't wearing the right type of boot. They would ask us to leave. It
Wow,
was like it was really bizarre,
that's crazy.
but so did you stay in the IFB pretty much your whole like childhood growing up into adulthood?
Yeah, right up until I went to college. I went to a state university initially as my freshman year, and my folks really didn't like that, and pressured me hard to go to Pensacola Christian College. And then I think I mentioned to you I got kicked out after like 2 semesters and 3/4 of one, like right
Right.
before finals. And that kind of radicalized me, actually. Up until that point, honestly, like when I before I went to Pensacola, I was the straightest edge kid I knew, pretty much.
Hmm.
And then I went there, and um, I couldn't do anything right. And I didn't actually put two and two together until several years later when I was talking to my dad, and I realized that I actually had a target on my back from the time I walked on campus because um, I have alopecia. I don't grow
Hmm.
hair, and
Hmm.
and so hair was a really big deal on that campus. Like they had hair check for guys and girls every month or so, and the guys, it wasn't just enough for the guys to have short hair, it had to be a certain style. Like there were some guys
Very.
who, yeah, like there's some guys who would they wanted to be a little bit individualistic, so they'd find ways to they'd cut their hair so it met the requirements, but they'd find a way to do it differently.
Hmm.
I don't know, like a pompadour or something goofy.
Right.
And they would find ways to they would write new rules in the rule book for that and crack down on them. But like with me, Um, I actually got called into the dean's office 3 times my first week on campus, and every time they were asking me to stop shaving my head.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And I didn't put that together because, as possibly the reason for all the other times that I got called into the dean's office until, like I said, later. But so, a little more info. Like I grow some hair, but it's not
Hmm.
even. So I shave it
Right.
because I want it uniform. It doesn't look nice. And um, there was actually a girl. There was one other person on campus who had alopecia, and they wouldn't let her wear a wig and wouldn't let her shave her head. And it, and I'm not saying this to be mean because I have this, but it looked awful. And I'm
Right.
saying like I feel bad. I felt so bad for her. Um, and but yeah, so I lasted two semesters and some change, and then got kicked out. I was part of an underground student newspaper, and like we weren't allowed to have internet access or anything, and
Hmm.
and the student newspaper was online, and we weren't allowed to have a student newspaper, and but I mean there were other reasons, like I got some body piercings and I forget what else, but um, yeah, and then I ended up uh, going. I would have gone to a secular school, like a state university, to finish out because
Yeah.
I was pretty irritated with Christianity in general. Of course, I was seeing Christianity through the lens of IFB. That was Christianity to me.
Right.
So I was like, I was taught that any other denomination, pretty much, none of them were going to heaven. So
Hmm.
IFB was it, and IFB just rejected me. So I really didn't want to go to a Christian school or religious school at all, but they're not accredited. So none of my credits would have gone anywhere if I went to a state university. And so I ended up going to a Christian college here in Georgia to finish out, and because they would accept some credits, and
Hmm.
because they're accredited. But anyways, so it worked out, and I'm glad that I did go to Toccoa Falls College. Is where I did my undergrad, because it gave me some insight into a denomination that wasn't IFB,
Yeah.
and exposed me to, it's like, so there are valid, legitimate forms of Christianity that aren't IFB, because otherwise I would hate Christianity in general forever
Hmm.
if I hadn't had that experience of going to a Christian college that wasn't quite as awful as Pensacola. Although, that's setting the bar pretty low, but anyway.
Yeah. Pensacola, Crown College of the Bible, and Knoxville and West Coast are like the three like really bad ones that I can think of the IFB colleges.
Yeah. Oh, Bob Jones is in there
Bob
too.
Jones. But what's funny is we were raised that Bob Jones turned liberal because Bob Jones Jr. or whoever took over and was no longer a good independent fundamental Baptist college to go to.
Hmm. He was wearing pleated pants or something.
I think it's because they started using a different version of the Bible.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's a big one for
It is a
IFB.
big one. Hmm.
That's interesting because when I was at Pensacola, to my knowledge, the two most similar schools in the world were Pensacola and Bob Jones, and you probably couldn't have found two campuses that hated each other more. And
Isn't it? It's so bad.
but it's classic fundamentalism, because it's
Yes,
like
it is.
we are it, and they're just outside of it. Like we don't even talk
Hmm.
about these people over here because of course but these guys are messing up the message. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so interesting because then that translates down into like the followers of these big colleges or these big pastors that come from these colleges. I grew up in, I call them camps. We call them camps. And it was like the North Georgia, Southern Tennessee camps of like Sammy Allen, Phil Kidd, Buster Seaton. And they were like really, really extreme. And they hated anyone that came out of Pensacola. or Crown College or West Coast or Bob Jones. But then if you get around Ruckmanites who
Oh
came
God.
from, yeah, Ruckmanites hated the Sextons who came from the Crown College, and it's like this continuous like turf war almost
Hmm.
with these egos, and it was just, to me, it's fascinating. I always told my husband, I tell my husband I should have been like a social anthropologist, because the behavior of people in these groups are so fascinating
Hmm.
because they believe the same thing.
Right.
It's but they're fighting and they're warring all the time.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it reminds me of some of my research on Islamic State because,
Mm-hmm.
as you look at religious fundamentalisms, they all look pretty similar in a lot of regards. And part of my dissertation focuses on Islamic State, where they spent more time in their propaganda arguing against other Muslims than they ever did talking about Christians or Jews. I mean, they'd be happy to
It's
murder those
amazing.
too, but
Right.
they spent much more time trying to discredit religious figures within Islam than they did Christianity or Judaism. So it kind of makes sense. It's you see the
Yeah.
similarities though, right? Like
Yes. Yeah. That's
the
really fascinating. Um, and it kind of a culture shock for you going from PCC to the Christian school
co-false.
in Georgia?
It was a little bit. I mean, I had a bit of an attitude because um, I kind of assumed that the culture would be so on the Pensacola campus. The administration and the faculty, everybody was out to get you, and your own roommates were out to get you. And so when I came on to Tacoma Falls campus, I was pretty gun shy, and it took me a little bit to figure out, like all the teachers aren't out to get me, and um, yeah, so and it was different because um, being around Christians, people who grew up second or third, fourth generation Christian, and who hadn't been traumatized the way everybody I grew up with was,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I I didn't relate to them. Like they didn't have all these terrible feelings that connected to the church and to religion, and sometimes it felt a little bit lonely, to be honest, because
Mm-hmm.
I I had so many bad feelings tied up with Christianity, and nobody related to it, and um yeah, I didn't, and I didn't and actually I felt a little bit like I didn't feel like I could talk about it that much. And now I wish I could go back and just own it, be like, yeah, I survived a cult, and
Right.
just but back then I was a little embarrassed about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, and I was homeschooled too, so I wasn't,
Yeah.
I feel it was nice that people weren't constantly screaming at me or calling me into the dean's office every other day, but it was also a little bit lonely. But
Yeah.
yeah, I had a hard time. I had people who wanted to be my friend, um, but I didn't know how to connect with them at that point. But I ended up, by my final year, I had a pretty big group of friends, but initially it wasn't that easy.
Yeah. I find it, the more people I talk to, because I struggle with interpersonal relationships, especially within my own peer group. Like, it doesn't matter what age I am, the peers around me I have a hard time relating to.
Mhm.
And I almost sometimes wonder if it is the isolation that we had between being homeschooled and then the isolation from just society in general. It makes, and also the fear that was instilled in us of the outside world, kind of like almost I hate the word handicap. That's not a good word. It limited our ability to be able to connect
Yeah.
to other people. and then add the trauma on top of that, there's nobody understands. Nobody
Right.
gets it.
Right. Nobody had any
And
idea.
no, and like my husband grew up IFB, but he did not grow up in the same environment like I did. He had a very healthy upbringing, very loving environment, whereas I grew up in extreme trauma and abuse. It was like really bad. And so relating to him and relating to his family, I can't like at all. They talk
Mm.
about all of these grand and wonderful memories, and I'm sitting there going, well, I can share trauma.
Right.
That's what I can share. But
Right.
nobody wants to hear that because it's kind of a damper on a party.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And then I see a lot of, especially on the IFB page, people talk about deconstruction, and I never ran into that word until I was on that page actually. And for me, it was almost like construction or integration into regular society. I
mhm.
wasn't so like I kind of just I don't know. I don't want to say it's not really accurate to say I threw all of it out because weirdly I was a young Earth creationist till I was like 25 or 26, and
Mhm.
so and like completely anti-abortion. Um, I think for me personally, it was a process. Like I went into journalism,
Mhm.
and that was my way of learning about the world because and weirdly enough, my first beat, they put me on the education beat. So I was covering education. I was like, you guys know I was homeschooled, right? Like,
You're like, "What are you doing?"
like I have no idea how the public school system works. I wasn't allowed to
Right.
enter one. Um,
Right.
so that was like I knew nothing about the world, and I so it was difficult to try to sort of create my own like learn about the world and then like create my own like ethical framework because I saw so many kids who would go through that kind of pressure that I went through, and they would either buckle and become like a cookie cutter IFB kid and get married at super young, have a bunch of
Yeah.
kids, or else they just explode out of there and start doing meth.
Right.
I mean
There was no
literally.
middle ground.
Yeah, it's because the whole you get your entire morality and ethics from this cult, and then it discredits, like everybody in authority discredits themselves by obsessing about stuff that doesn't matter. Like you can't go to a theater, you can't watch a movie even on a VCR, you can't girls
Mhm.
can't wear pants, all these things that are supposed to be, you know, terrible sins, and then you start realizing, this is bullshit. And but then there are some things that are actually valid, like don't
Mhm.
drink and drive, don't, like,
Yes.
and so it took a while to figure out, to separate out how to, behave as a, regular housebroken human being
Right.
when you,
Yeah.
like you threw out everything you knew, like what parts of it should I keep? And so that was
Yes.
quite a process for me. Um, and at the same time, of course, working as a reporter, I'm learning about this whole world out there that I had no idea about. Um, so yeah, it was. I still feel like I'm catching up. Like I always felt like I was behind, like pop
Mhm.
culture. Um, yeah, especially pop culture. Um, and I'm probably, I mean, some things I don't care if I'm behind on, but others, so many pop culture references still go over my head. And
Same.
yeah, no, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
Did you find as you were doing your journalism that there was a lot of things that we were told about the outside world that was just blatant bull crap?
yeah, like, um, well, that people people who weren't Christian had morality.
Right.
That was, oh my God, like seriously, it was I remember I briefly dated this girl, and I think her family was basically atheist, like religion just wasn't a part of their life, but she was actually really conservative, and
Mm-hmm.
like not politically, just socially. And I was like, what? I thought everyone who wasn't IFB was just a libertine, like.
Right.
So, and I was like, what do they base that on if they don't base it on scripture? And then, of course, that's the crazy thing. Like, if you didn't have, the threat of hellfire, like you're just gonna go
Yes.
out, rape and pillage and do drugs and kill people. I mean,
Yes. Yep.
but that's what we were taught. So that's why a lot of kids just go off the rails when they realize that this discredited sect doesn't hold the keys to morality. But then if they don't realize that they kind of have to create their own morality, or there's other sources of morality and ethics, then they get really lost. And
Mm-hmm.
I, um, I mean, I felt pretty lost for a while.
Yeah, I felt like I was like on a pendulum and I was like on this side with the IFB, then I swung way over here. And then as I started constructing myself, pulling the things that was actually good that I learned growing up and building myself back up, I landed somewhere in the middle. I was no longer IFB, but of course I wasn't over here doing meth in a corner either. But
Right.
it's a process. I mean, this has been a 15-year process for me
Mm-hmm.
to get somewhat still regulated somewhere in the middle ish. And I'm still learning and trying to figure things out. And it's like it's crazy how a lifetime of brainwashing is, and because that's what it is, they're brainwashing us from birth. It's so hard to shake some of these ideas out of your head, even though you may consciously make the decision not to believe that anymore. Sometimes they're still in there and they rattle around
Mm-hmm.
and come out as a reactionary behavior. Have you noticed that with yourself?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, sometimes. I mean, I am happy that I managed to come out. And don't get me wrong, I do have a good deal of bitterness toward IFB, but I do feel fortunate that I managed to come out of it without having bitterness toward Christianity or religion in general. Um,
Same.
but I do feel like it sets people like us up to give valid criticisms of certain elements of Christianity in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes I'm sure it comes off as though I'm only critical of Christianity, and it's like, well, that's where I came from. I wouldn't necessarily feel justified in critiquing a religion that I didn't grow up in.
Same.
And yeah, I mean, I think people don't understand. It's like, well, I criticize it because I feel a connection to it. So
Yeah. This is something I know inside and out because I lived it and now I'm out of it, and I have this lived knowledge and experience that I can call out the bull crap that's in there now.
yeah.
And I feel justified in doing so because I've lived it. Like I feel more comfortable talking against like the IFB and evangelicalism than I do Catholicism, because even
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism is very different,
Right.
very vastly different from IFB. And so I don't want to go, okay, now I'm going to attack the Catholics or I'm going to attack this, because that's not what I grew up in. This is my
Mm-hmm.
this is my voice here.
Mm-hmm.
And because I get that too. I'm like, they're like, why are you just going after this particular group? And I'm like, because that's my group. That's
Right.
where I came from. That's what I know.
None of these other groups abused me. None of these other
Yes.
groups gave me PTSD or trauma.
Yes.
You guys did.
Yes, exactly. And what's funny is as I started moving away from the IFB very, very slowly, the people that showed me the most compassion were atheists, agnostics, Catholics, and I actually had a few friends that were Wiccan.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the most kind and compassionate people. And nothing like what I was ever told they were like. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And like you said, they had a moral code. Like, how do you have a moral code if you're an atheist? You don't have a Bible. I mean, I couldn't understand that.
Right.
And and that really helped me start breaking away, going, okay, how much of this is really just normal being a good human, and how much of this is really the Bible,
Hmm.
and how much this do I need to start chucking out, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. I I didn't really. I was so once I moved away from Georgia because that was my first reporting job. I
Mm-hmm.
lived in Maine for a while and I was a reporter there. And I tried different denominations because I was still a Christian, but I never could find one that I think the closest I came to a Christian denomination that I felt okay at was Episcopalians
Yes.
because they, they seem they're not angry people. I mean,
Right.
it's not all this hellfire damnation stuff, and they care about their community, that sort of thing. But
Mm-hmm.
so I was like okay with them, but it wasn't like I never went there regularly. But I always still felt like I was a Christian until I moved to India, and I was around Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Sikhs. And I remember one moment I was on my balcony just looking down at like this little market area and seeing all these people like mingling. And I was thinking, these people believe in their religion just as fervently as my parents back home in Indiana do. And it's just ludicrous to think that um, one that I have proof or evidence that one is more valid than the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, that's what, and I get that other people use the term deconstruction. I never really felt that process because it was just in that moment I was like, oh, okay, I'm an agnostic, because
Mm-hmm.
that was it. And I love it. I mean, it's the laziest position to have. I don't have to prove anything.
Right. You're like, something's there, but I don't know, but it's
It could be.
okay.
Maybe there's
It
not
could
anything
be,
there.
maybe there's not.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love for there to be some higher meaning. Um, I mean, that'd be great. I'm not, I don't, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like uh, I have to. I don't see any evidence of it necessarily, but I don't see any evidence to the contrary. So I guess I'll
Right.
just live my life.
Yeah. Do you, yeah, do you think that if you had had the opportunity to grow up maybe in a more, like a less strict environment, that it would have had a different influence on maybe your outcome? Or
Yeah,
do you,
I can look back and think, 'cause, yeah, I mean, I probably would still be a Christian if I hadn't been raised IFB, because I there's this terrible conflict that I'm sure you felt as well when this is all you've ever known. This is, these authority figures are telling you how it is, and then they're doing terrible, abusive things, and there's something in you that just says this is wrong,
mhm,
but you don't have anything to base that on other than just this feeling of like moral outrage. But then you're being told that morality comes from them and from the Bible and the way that they interpret the Bible, and like physical abuse, psychological abuse, mental, all of that is right. And terms like you need to break the will of the child, that sort of thing, this is
yeah,
what's needed. And so I grew up feeling these deep conflictions of I don't have a framework to say this is wrong, but it feels wrong and looks wrong to me. And I guess I could thank IFB for that. I mean, like seriously, in a way, because it just I do have a strong sense of moral outrage or ethical outrage when I
Yeah.
see abusive situations, because I've
Mhm.
already, like, I feel like here's the normal level of, you know, anger toward, abuse. Mine's already up here, so like if something happens, I'm like, no, that's not right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and that's
Yeah.
not a bad thing necessarily.
No, I look at it as it has created in me a major skeptic. So I don't sell out 100% to anything anymore. Because I find that if you sell out I have found that if you sell out 100%, and it doesn't matter, it could be a political party, it could be a religion, it could be a job, you lose your sense of self. You lose that autonomy if you're sold out 100%.
Yeah.
And so I think the IFB for that, because of my trauma, I can look at something now more objectively and go, okay, wait a second. Let's see what's really going on here before I hop on board.
Mm-hmm.
And but along the lines of what you were saying, I too, like I grew up with this conflicting message of this is the rules, but this is what we're doing. Because I was unfortunately sexually abused as a young child, and
I'm
so I
sorry.
had this moral pushed on me that I had to be pure and innocent and all of these things, but at the same time the person saying that was the person abusing me.
Oh,
And
Jesus.
so like it was like this weird, no, this something's wrong. And then the only, like you said, the only thing that you could say had, all you had was your feeling,
Mm-hmm.
your moral outrage. But what they wanted to prove them wrong was scripture. But of
Right.
course they knew more scripture than you, especially as a kid, and they would twist it however they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had no, like we had no power at all to
Mm-hmm.
stand, like no two legs to stand on at all. And that's carried with me into my adulthood. Like if I still have problems with like pastors or men in authority in a church, if they start stepping over just a little bit, I call my PTSD spicy deja vu. And like it's all the bells start going off. And I'm like, nope, 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 nope. I'm not okay with this. Let's back up.
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's really it's almost, it's given me like a survival skill to be able to navigate situations I don't think I probably would have been able to navigate as an adult.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way about groups, joining groups, not joining groups. I occasionally go to a Buddhist temple here in Atlanta, and
Mm-hmm.
probably if I hadn't grown up IFB, I'd probably be, going to the temple every time it's open, stuff like that. But I only go when I feel like it. I don't feel the need to call myself a Buddhist. I don't feel the need,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that like a lot of other people who didn't grow up that way, they feel this need to be in some sort of a group, to be in, in a club or whatever. And I have an aversion to it.
I do too.
So yeah.
Yeah, because I have quite a few friends that have left the church, but they still have found groups to then identify themselves in.
Hmm.
And I'm still like this weird anomaly that's just kind of floating around in existence, not really attaching to any type of group. And I don't have a desire to.
Yeah.
I felt like I was labeled and that my voice was taken from me for so long that I don't want to put myself in that situation. I'd rather just be over here and
Yeah.
kind of dabble in different directions versus put myself in a situation where something like that could happen again.
Yeah. I yeah, I had this experience when I went to grad school back in like 2011, 2012, something like that. Ran into this girl who was had grown up quiverful. Have you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
it's really similar. And I didn't talk about my background that much because I was like, I've moved on. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of stuff since then, and I wasn't really owning it as my identity. And
Mm-hmm.
we got to talking at a party, and all of a sudden she's just obsessed. Like she had to talk to me all the time, about this. And and maybe, and I had to like put some boundaries because I was like, I don't want to, every time I'm in the room with you, I don't want to stand there and talk for 2 hours about IFB and Quiverful, because
Right.
it brings back a lot of trauma. And um but I also hadn't gotten to the point where I sort of owned that history too. And I
Mm-hmm.
will say there's like one exception to the groups that I feel like I need to belong to, and that's the IFB group,
Mm-hmm.
the survivors, because of
Yeah.
course that one I didn't really choose. I mean, I was
Yeah.
forced to be that. But yeah, I'm not saying, it was just not the right time for me to talk about it. And so, but now, these days now, I actually find it really interesting, especially since, with my research, I'm looking at fundamentalist sects and like the similarities, and um, how to navigate that world.
Yeah. What are some of the similarities that you're seeing across the board? Because are you doing just like Islam and Christian? Or are you doing like all the different types of religions fundamental?
Well, the most recent research I did focused actually slightly different, but it was on apocalyptic groups, which
Mm-hmm.
Islamic State is an apocalyptic group, IFB is an apocalyptic group, and that's basically just any group that sort of looks toward the end times, or their version of the end times. Um, and like the Branch Davidians. I don't know if you're
Mm-hmm.
old enough to remember. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
um, Waco, and
Yep.
so
Wasn't
the
Jim Jones part of that group? I mean, he wasn't
he
Branch
was
Davidian, but
he
he
was an
was very.
that was an apocalyptic group. I could have put them into my article, but the I had a couple other groups that were too similar to them, so there's no point in having them in. I could have thrown them in the mix, but no. So I look for to make policy recommendations to like governments, to like, how do you deal with this group if it's potentially violent.
Mm-hmm.
And like so Branch Davidians in Waco, that was obviously a tragedy. And what the biggest mistake that the feds made was they didn't listen to religious experts who were telling them, look, they're probably not going to do anything too crazy. I mean, violent. I mean, they did a lot of crazy stuff, but
Right.
they're not necessarily going to be violent. If you listen to what they're actually saying, there's not imminent violence. So if they listened to the religious experts, they could have averted that tragedy. But in the case of I also looked at Islamic State, of course, and then I'm looking at QAnon.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're not religious per se, but they are
Mm-mm.
apocalyptic. They always talk
Yes.
about the storm, and so they're a complete different ball of wax. They don't have, so like the Branch Davidians, you could sort of predict what they might do because they had like an existing sacred text that they're really attached to. Same with Islamic State. But like with QAnon, they're literally making it up as they go. So you have
Right.
to deal with them a little bit differently. With them, basically you just deplatform them and take them off of Twitter, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah.
But as far
What
as like,
what do
yeah,
you find what do you find fascinating about QAnon? I don't know a lot of if a lot of the viewers will be familiar with QAnon. I find them fascinating, but
okay.
what do you what do you find very interesting about the QAnon community that may be different from like religious sects? I mean,
Okay.
obviously they're
Yeah.
not religious, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. Although a lot of them are, and
Yes.
a lot of them are Christian, but so it's almost like watching sausage being made, because every religion, at some point didn't have an existing sacred text. But QAnon, like I said, they're making up as they go. So
Mm-hmm.
this is probably a group of people behind Q. And what they do, it's kind of clever. They'll put out some sort of cryptic statement and emphasizing certain words and whatnot, and they'll post it online. And then they've got this whole slew of people who are not in touch with them whatsoever, who will speculate on what's going on. And it actually reminds me a lot of how David Koresh with the Branch Davidians was operating, because he had an existing sacred text, which you could
Mm-hmm.
compare to the Q drops. But and he, instead of only looking like we did at IFB at like what the literal words said, he was
Mm-hmm.
extrapolating out and writing like, this is what it means, like this is the bigger picture, this is the fulfillment. So that's what they're kind of, these YouTube, they call them Q-tubers, will do. They'll look at these Q drops and say, so Q said like this tiny little bit and of information, and then they like extrapolate out. And so the clever little mechanism is that Q will sit back and wait a few days or a week, and then whoever came up with the best conspiracy theory, basically, Q will latch onto that and be like, see, so and so, got it. And then it encourages everybody else to be like, oh, like we really need to pay attention. So they're making up their text as they go. And I don't think that they're ever going to have like a book of,
Mm-hmm.
the gospel of Q. but but like my research was looking at what happens when an apocalyptic group makes a prophecy that doesn't come true. Like the Branch Davidians, they were making prophecies, and that didn't work out. Islamic State made some, and Turkish Turkish backed armed forces made sure that one particular prophecy didn't come through, and that totally
Mm-hmm.
delegitimized them. And then, but with Q, they don't have, like I said, they don't have an existing sacred text that pins them down. So
Mm-hmm.
they just, whenever they say, okay, January 6th, Donald Trump's going to be reinstated, and it doesn't happen, it's not that big of a deal to them, because they just move the goalposts and they go and find some archaic text somewhere that, and they're like, oh well, so the real date's going to be like August 6th, and it keeps going because they're just making it up. So it's not as
Yeah.
easy to delegitimize QAnon, because it's hard to pin them down, as far as their prophecies. They'll just reinterpret it. So
Right. And without having it written text, they can have multiple scapegoats too, going, well,
yeah,
January 6th maybe was the original date, but oh, Mike Pence messed this up because
yeah,
he's this. And
mm-hmm,
then we move on to the next date. Well, this came up and this is why it's changed.
mm-hmm,
And they can continuously change the narrative, and
mm-hmm,
people just kind of eat it and
yeah,
latch onto it.
yeah. And bringing it back to IFB,
Yeah.
even though we were very literalist in how we approached the text, but there were some pastors, evangelists out there who get into numerology, at least at my
Mm-hmm.
church. And so, and they would, extrapolate out from the text. And we had a couple who would try to make predictions, especially as the year 2000 approached.
Oh
And
gosh, yes.
yeah, and they'd be like, well, I'm not saying it is this, but everything adds up if you count the letters in Jesus name or whatever and divide by
Yes.
8, then it comes up to the year 2000. And then when that didn't happen, then they're like, oh, here's the thing that we missed, you really have to look at this verse in Daniel, or some
Yes.
BS.
Yeah, I remember one pastor, it was like I think it was 98. And they were gearing up for 1999, and he was talking about how a red calf was born in
Mm-hmm.
Israel,
Yep.
and this red calf symbolized Jesus was coming in 1999 before 2000. And it was just like the numerology stuff. They were just pulling stuff basically out of their ass.
Yeah.
And then once 2000 hit and we had our entire stockroom full of beanie weenies and bottled water, you know, nothing happened.
Right.
And then what do they do? Oh, Daniel said this. We just, no man knows the day, really. No man knows
Right.
the time, really.
Right. Well, there's always that cop out, but I think it's in Matthew. One of their favorite verses was just as it was in the days of Noah, people will be eating and drinking and marrying and giving to marriage,
Yes.
and there will be wars and rumors of wars. That's when, the Son of Man will come. But it's like, okay, that's really convenient, because when has there been a time in history when people weren't eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and having wars and rumors of war? And I
Exactly.
mean, it's pretty lazy, really.
It is. I mean, because if you look back over, because I'm a big history nerd, like obsessively so. I mean, World War II would have been a good point if they were like, oh my God, Jesus is coming back. World War II was pretty bad. World War I was pretty bad.
Yeah.
There is, I mean, the Crusades were bad. I mean, they said they did that in Jesus' name, but that's just bull crap. But, it's like there's always been some type of catastrophe, some type of natural disaster, some type of something going on to be considered end times.
Hmm.
Always. And like you said, it's really convenient because that's always, it's just human nature. You're never going to find a time with it that we have peace, 100% of peace.
Right. I mean, if you're that type of pastor, and Sunday's coming up and you don't have anything prepared for a sermon, that's an easy one. You just go look at the headlines and like, oh, there's violence and blah blah blah, earthquake
Mm-hmm.
over here.
Yep.
And so, yeah, you
Yep.
had a steady stream of that.
My biggest pet peeve, I mean, and it really makes me angry, is whenever they would use natural disasters and say they were judgments of God.
Right.
And it's like, no, how dare you do that? That is not okay, to take tragedy and say, well, God's just showing judgment on our nation because of this, that, and the other.
Well, I mean, and even worse, maybe not even worse, but maybe equally bad. I saw it on like the individual level where, just a specific example, this one guy in the church, his daughter had anorexia, and some other guy in the church approached her father and said, well, this is God's judgment because you've been talking bad about the pastor. So,
Oh my gosh, I've heard that too. I've heard people say, well, if you do this against the man of God, God's going to kill you in a car accident.
mhm.
Or if you commit this type of sin, God's going to take you out early because you're not going to be any use for him whenever you get older. Trying
Mhm.
to frighten like the younger kids to stay good and trying to keep the adults in line.
Yeah.
Just, it's sick. It's sick and it's twisted.
Mhm.
And
Well, that the
I
patriarch,
remember,
yeah.
yeah,
Go
go,
ahead.
go ahead, good. The
Uh,
patriarchy.
I was just going to say, that's an aspect of the patriarchy, and you were asking like what were some of the similarities between fundamentalist groups in different religions, and patriarchy is one that's across the board, whether it's Islam, Judaism, Christianity. Um, but one that is kind of interesting to me is that most of them claim that they um, they take all of their doctrine, all of their beliefs directly from their sacred text, and without extra interpretation or anything like that. It's just how it was written with the intent of the authors or whatever. And but the thing is, it's not true in any case. That in every single case, they all have different interpretations of the sacred text than most of the mainstream leaders of their own faith. Like IFB, like most theologians in Christianity wouldn't agree with their interpretation of most of the Bible. I mean, and then another one that also relates to that is the demonization of LGBTQ people. That's pretty
Mm.
much across the board. And and you were saying when we were kids that the adults had an advantage over us because they knew more scriptures than us. Well, not anymore, and like we know that there's only 2 or 3 places in the entire Bible that could be construed to even mention same-sex sex.
Yes.
And then there's other passages, many passages. I mean, I could make a strong case for David and Jonathan for having a same-sex relationship.
100%. Oh my goodness.
I mean,
Yeah,
if
I
you're reading
completely
it,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, if you just took it at face value, like they try to say, then it's like, Jonathan, my love, your love was stronger than the love for women. I mean, it goes on and on
Yes.
and on, and they just
Yes.
that just goes right over. Like, what?
And then they'll try to like interpret it out as being more masculine. Well, it was like a manly
Manly
hug
love?
or manly, yes, a man love. And I'm like, isn't that still? I mean, like, do you
Right,
hear what you're saying? Right? That's what I want to say to them. Like, do you hear what you're saying? But I agree.
right.
I really think that there was a relationship between Jonathan and David. That was that IFB and Christianity in general just want to glaze over.
I thought it was a beautiful story too. And
Mm-hmm.
then also on alcohol, I mean, there's so many mentions of Jesus drinking wine. I'm like, I thought we were supposed to read this
Yes.
literally. Why are you doing all these mental gymnastics to say that that's not what
Yes.
that says?
I love so much they literally would tell us this basically Welch's grape juice.
Right.
I'm like,
Yeah. Where did you,
what?
what's the evidence of that?
Right? What? I mean, if you think about it though, back then, I mean, water wasn't clean. If you look at the cultural context in the time period, most people didn't really drink water. They
Yeah.
drink wine primarily because most of the water sources were contaminated. And so they had a pretty high alcohol tolerance. It's not
Mm.
like they were always getting drunk, you know? And I don't know, it just makes me laugh. Just the idiocracy sometimes that comes from the alcohol argument. It just makes me chuckle.
Right. Well, then of course, men are supposed to wear pants. Well, everybody wore robes back then, as far as I know. I mean,
Yes. Well, that's why they had to gird their robes up and tie them between their legs before they went into battle because they were basically in dresses.
I mean, I spent some time in the Middle East. I mean, a lot of guys still wear full length robes. I mean,
Yeah.
so not a lot
Well, I
has
mean,
changed.
if you look at, um, Caucasian background, the Scottish men wear skirts. They
Right.
wear their kilts. But what's funny is the IFB world I grew up in did not mind kilts.
They
They
did
were
what?
okay.
They're
They
okay
didn't
with men
mind.
wearing
They were
kilts.
they were okay with kilts,
Mm.
but only because they were Scottish. That
Right.
was like I'm like, what? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. None of it
Well,
makes sense.
the like I would go round and round with my parents on that, and their strongest argument, like the one that they would use before they stomped out, would be like, well, look at any bathroom in the United States. The symbol is like the woman wearing a dress. I was like, that's where you're getting your theology from? Is bathroom
Bathroom
signs?
sign.
I mean,
Yes. I mean, and even down to colors that male and female were allowed to wear.
mhm,
Like boys weren't, at least in the world I grew up in, boys were not allowed to wear like pinks or purples or any shades of yellow because they were feminine colors. And the girls stayed more with like the feminine, softer colors. And if you look historically, it wasn't until like the early 1900s that they switched. Boys were actually more in pinks and more pastel colors than the girls were in the blues. And so it was just a cultural shift in how they wanted to dress their kids in like I think it was like early 1900s. And then they started identifying blue as boy and pink as girl. So it was only in the last like 120 years. But they're holding on to it because it's gender
mhm,
specific. But I'm
right,
like, men used to wear pantyhose and high heels
right, and wigs and makeup.
and wigs and makeup. So,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of silliness that goes on in fundamentalist Christianity in the U.S. I mentioned that I was grateful that I had gone to Christian college at Toccoa Falls College, where they weren't so crazy, and I saw a slightly more loving version of Christianity. But there's one other experience that I had that I'm kind of grateful for. As I lived in Egypt for a while, and they have the Coptic Christians have been there forever, and they this community, they're basically everything that evangelical Christians imagine themselves to be. They are a minority. They don't have a lot of political power. They are persecuted. Um, and they are, I mean, I don't want to generalize across the board, but like the ones that I met were so loving. And so, like, the way Jesus is depicted actually in the New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
um, and not pushy about their faith. This one moment really stuck out to me. I was in a taxi, and you could tell a lot of the Coptic Christians, because on the inside of their wrists they'd have a cross, or just three dots meaning a cross. And I was practicing my Arabic, and talking to him, and I asked, I was like, "Oh, you're a Coptic Christian?" He's like, "Yeah, yeah." And he was telling me about his faith and that sort of thing. And he asked me if I was religious. I was like, "Well, my parents are, but I'm not." But like we got to the place where I was going to get out, and he's like, "You really should become a Christian, because you I really want you to go to heaven when you die." And he like was getting teary,
Oh,
but it wasn't pushy. I was like, it wasn't some bait and switch thing. Like, it
yeah.
wasn't, and it was like so genuine. And I was like, man, I wish I could take every stick up the butt IFB person who's still in it, and fly them over to Egypt and introduce them to some of these Coptic Christians who actually like live this faith as these people at IFB imagine themselves to be. Because evangelical Christians imagine themselves to be persecuted when they're the strongest voting bloc in the most powerful country in the world.
Right.
It's absurd, the persecution complex that they have. And when, with IFB, they're, at least my church, they were going out knocking on people's doors every Saturday and trying to convert them. And they're some of the most hateful people. Not all of them, obviously, but some of the most hateful people I ever knew were fervent IFB folks. And
Yes.
like, you are so unchristlike. And so, yeah, if I had been raised around people who were like the Coptic Christians, I'd be a Christian this day, I'm sure. But yeah, so IFB, thanks a lot.
Woohoo! We're burning that t-shirt now.
Right. But yeah.
Yeah, man, I have really appreciated you being on today. Like, your stories and just stuff that you've talked about has been very relatable, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, and I guess we'll wrap it up now. We're coming up to an hour, so is there anything that you want to leave with, or if there's anything? Here's the question that I ask everybody: if there's something that you could have told yourself in college that would have helped in navigating this Christianity, what do you think you would have told yourself?
Oh, geez.
I know I put everybody on the spot. I'm so sorry, and I hate when people do that to me.
I would have probably told myself, don't be so stuck on Christianity. Think about other options. Think about, I wish I could have had the experience I had that moment in India, when I realized that all these people believe just as strongly as my parents do, and not try to force your existence into this framework of IFB, and just if you can, don't feel pressured to try to make it fit, because it doesn't fit. Reality doesn't fit with that.
Yeah, Yeah, that's amazing because it is a tiny box that we have to try to force ourselves into if we want to be IFB, and it's not worth it. You lose a lot of yourself
Yeah,
getting placed inside that box.
yeah.
So, well, I appreciate you so much for coming on today and sharing with us. And if you all have your own story that you would like to share, the information on how to get a hold of me is in the description below. Until next time, everybody, everyone has a story. What's yours?